The 16-year-old king can barely hold the reins. His fingers, what's left of them, are wrapped in silk bandages that seep pus and blood through the fabric. The disease eating him alive has already claimed his right eye, turning half his face into a mask of rotting flesh that terrifies his own courtiers. He shouldn't be on a horse. He shouldn't be wearing 60 pounds of chainmail that rub his open sores into agony. He definitely shouldn't be leading 500 half-starved knights against Saladin's army of 26,000 that surrounds them like an ocean of steel. But Baldwin IV of Jerusalem, the Leper King, raises what remains of his sword hand and prepares to charge. Because in about 30 seconds, this boy whose body is literally decomposing will pull off one of the most impossible military victories in human history. The Battle of Montgizard is about to begin, and a teenager who should be dead will humiliate the greatest Muslim commander since the Prophet himself. This isn't Hollywood fiction. This is the true story of a dying child who held off the inevitable fall of Crusader Jerusalem through pure will, tactical genius, and a refusal to let something as trivial as his flesh falling off stop him from saving his kingdom. While his nobles plotted his replacement and his doctors counted his days, Baldwin IV was busy rewriting the rules of medieval warfare from a body that betrayed him more each sunrise. By the time death finally claimed him at 24, he'd fought more battles than most healthy kings manage in a lifetime, each victory more impossible than the last as leprosy stole his sight, his feeling, and finally his ability to move, but never his ability to lead. This is the story of the boy who saved Jerusalem by refusing to die on schedule. Chapter 1. The touch that changed history. The game was simple enough. Young nobles training for knighthood by wrestling and pinching each other, testing pain tolerance as warriors must. 9-year-old Prince Baldwin laughed as his friends tried to make him yield, their fingers digging into his arms with increasing force. But something was wrong. While other boys yelped and squirmed, Baldwin felt nothing. Not bravery masking pain, but genuine absence of sensation. His tutor, William of Tyre, watched with growing horror as the prince's playmates left bloody nail marks on his arm, while Baldwin smiled, genuinely puzzled by their exhaustion. That evening, William performed simple tests that confirmed his worst fears. Pins pushed into Baldwin's right arm drew blood but no flinch. Hot water that would make anyone recoil felt like nothing to the prince. The diagnosis was devastating. Leprosy, the living death that turned its victims into walking corpses, shunned by society and God alike. In medieval understanding, leprosy was God's judgment made flesh. Lepers were legally dead, forbidden from inheriting property, required to ring bells warning of their approach, banished to colonies where they rotted together in isolation. For a prince of Jerusalem, heir to the most precarious throne in Christendom, the diagnosis should have meant immediate disinheritance. But Baldwin's father, King Amalric I, made a decision that would reshape history. The boy would remain heir. The kingdom needed stability more than it needed a healthy king. This choice would damn Jerusalem to be ruled by a corpse and save it from immediate conquest. The bitter irony was that Baldwin's curse would become the kingdom's twisted blessing. A king too sick to be worth assassinating, too determined to be swept aside by ambitious nobles. The moment of diagnosis itself deserves deeper examination for what it reveals about medieval medical understanding and royal psychology. William of Tyre's account, written years later, captures the grinding realization that transformed an evening's concern into lifetime catastrophe. He first tested sensation with a feather, the lightest touch that should provoke reflexive response. Nothing. Then pressure, increasing gradually from fingertip to forceful grip. Baldwin watched with intelligent curiosity as his tutor's face shifted from concentration to barely concealed panic. The final test involved flame, not burning the prince, but bringing candle heat close enough that any normal person would instinctively withdraw. Baldwin reached towards the flame, fascinated by its dance, until William grabbed his hand away. The boy's first question wasn't about his condition, but whether this meant he couldn't be a proper knight. That practical concern, from a 9-year-old facing death sentence, revealed the extraordinary character already forming within the diseased body. William of Tyre, the prince's tutor and future chronicler, took on a heartbreaking task, preparing a dying child to rule a kingdom surrounded by enemies. Every lesson carried double weight. Baldwin had to learn faster than any prince before him because he had less time. While other noble children studied at leisure, Baldwin devoured texts on strategy, law, and theology with desperate intensity. He learned Arabic to read captured Muslim texts, understanding that knowing one's enemy was crucial when outnumbered 10-1. Mathematics and engineering became obsessions as he grasped that Jerusalem's survival depended on maximising defensive advantages. Most importantly, William taught him to hide weakness. A king who couldn't feel pain must never show it. A boy watching his body rot must project strength. Every public appearance became a performance where Baldwin played the role of healthy heir while leprosy claimed him piece by piece. King Amalric's decision to maintain Baldwin as heir wasn't made in isolation, but after agonising consultation with Jerusalem's highest nobles and clerics. The kingdom's precarious position meant succession crises could prove fatal. Alternative heirs existed: Baldwin's younger sister Sibylla, various cousins with Byzantine connections. But each option brought complications. A female ruler invited challenges in a military state. Foreign princes meant potential absorption by Constantinople or European powers. The council that met in secret to discuss Baldwin's future included men who'd seen kingdoms fall to succession disputes. The Patriarch of Jerusalem argued that God's will was inscrutable. Perhaps he intended this trial for divine purposes. The master of the hospital suggested that a king who suffered Christ-like affliction might inspire greater loyalty than a healthy ruler. The pragmatist pointed out that Baldwin showed exceptional intelligence and that leprosy progressed slowly. He might have a decade of effective rule. The decision emerged from calculated desperation. Better a leper king than civil war. The disease progressed with cruel precision. First, the nerve damage spread from his right arm through his body, creating dead zones where injuries went unnoticed until infection set in. Then came the visible signs, lesions that refused to heal, a coarsening of features as the disease attacked his face. By age 11, Baldwin's condition was an open secret at court. Nobles who bowed to the prince whispered about succession behind closed doors. Muslim spies reported gleefully that Jerusalem's heir was cursed by Allah. But Baldwin responded to his body's betrayal with iron discipline. He exercised relentlessly, building strength to compensate for failing nerves. He learned to write left-handed as his right hand curled into a claw. When riding became difficult, he had special reins created that he could grip without feeling. Every adaptation was a small victory against an implacable enemy. The psychological impact on young Baldwin can only be imagined through scattered references in contemporary accounts. Children are naturally resilient, but facing progressive disfigurement while maintaining royal dignity required extraordinary mental fortitude. William of Tyre mentions finding his pupil weeping only once, not from pain but from frustration, when his damaged hands couldn't properly hold a sword during training. The prince's response was characteristic. He designed a leather grip that compensated for his weakness and practiced until muscle memory replaced sensation. Other children might have retreated into self-pity or denial. Baldwin seems to have chosen radical acceptance, studying his disease with the same intensity he applied to military tactics. He learned which activities accelerated deterioration, how to recognize infections before they became dangerous, what modifications allowed continued function. This clinical approach to his own decay would serve him well as king, allowing him to maximize capability within steadily shrinking boundaries. The court of Jerusalem was a snake pit where Baldwin's illness added fresh venom. The kingdom, established by the First Crusade just 60 years earlier, survived through a delicate balance of military might, diplomatic manoeuvring, and sheer audacity. Surrounded by Muslim powers that grew stronger each year, while European support dwindled, Jerusalem needed strong leadership. A leper king seemed like God's cruelest joke. Factions formed around alternative candidates. Baldwin's younger sister Sibylla, various cousins with thin claims, ambitious nobles who saw opportunity in chaos. His mother, Agnes of Courtenay, manoeuvred frantically to secure her son's position, making deals that would later haunt the kingdom. Every court ceremony became a test as Baldwin learned to navigate politics while hiding trembling hands inside gloves, standing straight despite legs that increasingly betrayed him. The death of King Amalric in 1174 triggered the crisis everyone feared, yet no one had adequately prepared for. Baldwin was 13 years old, visibly diseased, facing a kingdom where half the nobles questioned his right to rule and Muslim enemies pressed every border. The coronation itself was a masterpiece of political theatre. Baldwin stood for hours in the stifling heat of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, wearing ceremonial robes that tortured his sensitive skin, holding regalia that his damaged hands could barely grip. When the crown was placed on his head, some swore they saw him sway, but he remained standing through sheer will. The boy king's first act was to confirm all existing privileges and positions, buying time with stability. His second was to appoint Reynaud of Châtillon, a violent but effective military commander, as his regent. It was a devil's bargain. Reynaud's brutality would buy the kingdom time, while Baldwin learned to rule, but it would also create enemies whose hatred would outlive them all. The early months of Baldwin's reign were a careful dance between showing strength and hiding weakness. He held court daily, demonstrating that a leper could still dispense justice. He rode out with patrols, proving he could still mount a horse despite hands that struggled with reins. Most importantly, he studied. Every night, while his body fought its losing battle against disease, Baldwin's mind absorbed everything about his kingdom's defences, his enemies' weaknesses, the delicate alliances that kept Jerusalem from being swept into the sea. He memorised water sources, fortress supplies, the loyalty and competence of every commander. Knowledge became his weapon against both the disease destroying his body and the enemies circling his kingdom. By his 14th birthday, Baldwin IV understood Jerusalem's strategic situation better than generals who'd fought there for decades. The transformation from diseased boy to warrior king required teachers who saw past Baldwin's rotting flesh to the brilliant mind within. Chief among them was William of Tyre, but the young king's true military education came from scarred veterans of Outremer's endless wars. Men like Humphrey II of Toron, constable of the kingdom, who taught Baldwin that victory came not from strength, but from making enemies overconfident. Balian of Ibelin showed him how to read terrain like scripture, finding defensive advantages in every hill and wadi. These men initially approached their leprous student with mixture of pity and duty. They left with something approaching awe. Baldwin absorbed tactical lessons with frightening speed, asking questions that revealed intuitive grasp of concepts that took others years to master. More disturbing to some, he showed no adolescent bravado, no dreams of glorious charges. The boy king understood from the beginning that Jerusalem survived through intelligence, not heroics. The teaching methods adapted to Baldwin's condition revealed medieval ingenuity and compassion. When his hands could no longer properly grip a sword, the kingdom's finest weaponsmiths collaborated with its best fighters to create modified techniques. They developed a style that used locked wrist positions, allowing Baldwin to direct a blade through arm and shoulder movement rather than finger control. Training sessions became exercises in creative adaptation. The master of the temple himself spent hours with the young king, not teaching traditional forms, but inventing new ones that worked within Baldwin's limitations. They discovered that his inability to feel pain, while dangerous, provided certain advantages. He never flinched from blows, never hesitated from fear of injury. This psychological edge unnerved sparring partners who faced an opponent who seemed immune to their strikes. Baldwin learned to use this intimidation factor, developing a fighting style that appeared supernatural in its disregard for self-preservation. Baldwin's physical training was a daily torture that he endured with grim determination. As feeling fled his extremities, he had to learn to fight by sight rather than touch. Hours were spent practicing sword work, watching in mirrors to correct positions he couldn't feel. He developed a unique fighting style that relied on brutal efficiency rather than finesse, strikes that used his whole body's momentum because he couldn't trust his grip. Riding required special saddles with straps to keep him mounted when his legs went numb. His knights watched their teenage king struggle with basic movements that came naturally to them, never complaining, adapting with ingenious solutions. When his right hand became too damaged to hold a sword properly, he trained his left while designing a special brace that let him still couch a lance. The master of the Templars reportedly wept watching Baldwin practice, seeing a boy refuse to yield even as his body crumbled. The intellectual component of Baldwin's military education proved even more crucial than physical training. He studied every battle fought in the Levant since the First Crusade, analysing victories and defeats with obsessive detail. William of Tyre brought him captured Muslim military treatises, which Baldwin had translated and memorised. He learned that Saladin's forces excelled at mobile warfare, but struggled with extended sieges. He understood that Crusader heavy cavalry remained devastating in direct engagement but vulnerable to harassment and attrition. Most importantly, he grasped that Jerusalem's numerical inferiority made conventional warfare suicidal. Victory required asymmetric thinking, using terrain, fortifications, and psychology to multiply limited forces. Baldwin developed what modern militaries would call force multiplication doctrine, detailed plans for making one knight fight like 5 through superior positioning and timing. His chamber became a war college where teenage insight challenged veteran assumptions. The political education was equally crucial. Jerusalem's survival depended on playing Muslim factions against each other while maintaining the fiction of Crusader unity. Baldwin learned to read the subtle signs of court intrigue, which nobles met secretly, who was building private armies, where loyalty was genuine versus purchased. He developed a network of informants that included everyone from kitchen servants to confessor priests. Knowledge of others' secrets became armour against their ambitions. When Baron X plotted with Baron Y, Baldwin knew before they'd finished their wine. When Muslim merchants reported troop movements to make extra silver, the information reached the king within hours. This intelligence network, built by a teenager who couldn't trust his own body, became Jerusalem's early warning system against both internal coups and external invasions. The construction of this intelligence network deserves special attention for its sophistication. Baldwin recognised that traditional spy systems, relying on professional agents, were too expensive and unreliable for Jerusalem's limited resources. Instead, he built what modern intelligence services would call a human intelligence network, based on mutual benefit rather than payment. Merchants received trade privileges for information about Muslim preparations. Priests heard confessions that revealed noble conspiracies. Servants in great houses understood that reporting suspicious activities to the king might earn freedom or advancement. Even lepers in colonies became intelligence sources, invisible observers whom others ignored. Baldwin personally managed key agents, meeting them in secret despite the physical toll such clandestine activities took. His ability to remember vast amounts of detail, who said what to whom, which caravans carried unusual goods, what fortresses received suspicious supplies, compensated for his inability to maintain written records his failing hands couldn't produce. The religious aspect of kingship posed unique challenges for a leper king. Medieval theology was conflicted about disease. Was it God's punishment for sin, or a test of faith like Job's? Baldwin navigated this carefully, publicly accepting his condition as God's will, while privately raging against the injustice. He attended Mass daily, despite the humiliation of fellow Christians shrinking from him. He made spectacular donations to churches and hospitals, particularly those serving lepers. But his true religious education came from wrestling with theodicy. How could a just God curse a child with living death, then demand he save the Holy Land? Baldwin's conclusion, expressed in letters to William of Tyre, was pragmatic rather than mystical. If God wanted a leper king, then leprosy must somehow serve divine purpose. Perhaps a king who was already dying would fight with less fear of death. By 15, Baldwin had developed the leadership style that would characterise his reign, a mixture of brilliant strategy and calculated theatre. He understood that appearing strong mattered as much as being strong. Court ceremonies were choreographed to minimise his disabilities while maximising his presence. He stood when others sat, projecting vitality despite exhaustion. He wore gloves not just to hide damage, but chose ones that drew attention: silver thread, jewelled knuckles, making them symbols of power rather than shame. When he could no longer sign documents normally, he developed a distinctive mark that required his damaged hands' exact pressure pattern, turning disability into unforgeable authentication. Every adaptation was public proof that the Leper King would not yield to his disease or enemies. The young king's daily routine would have broken most healthy adults. He rose before dawn for private exercises that kept his failing body functional. Morning court sessions required him to sit motionless for hours, projecting attention despite nerve pain that felt like burning needles. Afternoons were spent in military councils, where he had to outthink generals 3 times his age. Evenings brought diplomatic negotiations with envoys who watched for any sign of weakness to report to their masters. Through it all, Baldwin maintained a facade of energetic youth, while his body screamed for rest. Only his inner circle knew about the blood-soaked bandages changed hourly, the special shoes that accommodated feet losing their shape, the poppy wine that let him sleep, despite pain that would have maddened others. Each day survived was a victory against both disease and the vultures circling Jerusalem's throne. The preparation for his first major military test came sooner than anyone expected. By late 1174, Saladin had emerged from the chaos following Nur ad-Din's death as the strongest Muslim leader in decades. The Kurdish general who'd risen from nothing now controlled Egypt and was moving to claim Syria. For the first time since the Crusades began, the Muslim world threatened to unite under a single, capable commander. Baldwin, barely 14 and struggling to hold a sword, would have to match wits and weapons with one of history's great conquerors. The boy who couldn't feel pain would have to inflict it on an enemy who outnumbered him 10-1. As 1175 dawned, the Leper King prepared for a war everyone knew he couldn't win. Armed with a body that betrayed him daily and a mind that refused to accept defeat. The final element of Baldwin's preparation involved something no military manual discussed: learning to inspire men despite physical revulsion. Medieval warriors followed strength, vitality, the promise of victory embodied in their leader's person. Baldwin offered none of these traditional inspirations. Instead, he had to create new forms of charisma based on courage, intelligence, and shared suffering. He learned to use his disease strategically, reminding knights that he faced death daily while asking them to risk it occasionally. His speeches, carefully crafted with William of Tyre, drew parallels between his bodily suffering and Christ's passion, transforming military service into religious duty. When he reviewed troops, he made sure they saw his bandaged hands still gripping his sword, his diseased face still studying their formations. The message was clear: if the Leper King could fight, no one had excuse for cowardice. This psychological mastery would prove as crucial as any tactical innovation when the moment of testing arrived. Chapter 3: Blood in the Sand, the Miracle of Montgizard. The situation in November 1177 was beyond desperate. It was mathematically impossible. Saladin had assembled 26,000 men for what he intended as Jerusalem's death blow. The kingdom's main army was in the north, bogged down besieging Harim. Baldwin IV, now 16 and showing severe deterioration from his disease, commanded barely 500 knights and perhaps 3,000 infantry in the capital. Rational leadership would have retreated behind Jerusalem's walls and prayed. But Baldwin had spent 3 years studying Saladin's psychology, and he recognised opportunity in catastrophe. The Muslim commander, confident in overwhelming numbers, had allowed his army to disperse for raiding. His scouts reported the Leper King was too sick to ride, intelligence that was weeks out of date. Baldwin made a decision that his counsellors thought was fever-induced madness. Jerusalem would attack. The preparations for this impossible venture revealed Baldwin's evolution from sick boy to strategic mastermind. He understood that conventional tactics meant certain death, so every element of his battle plan involved psychological warfare. First, he orchestrated a campaign of deliberate misinformation. Agents spread rumours that the king was indeed bedridden, even staging a false medical crisis complete with priests, administering last rites within earshot of known spies. Meanwhile, Baldwin secretly gathered his forces, timing movements to avoid Muslim reconnaissance. He selected only his most reliable troops, men who'd sworn personal oaths rather than mercenaries who might flee when they saw the odds. The temple and hospital orders, usually jealous of their independence, were brought into unified command through a mixture of religious appeal and strategic logic. Baldwin spent precious hours personally briefing every knight commander, ensuring they understood not just what to do, but why. This attention to detail, from a king who could barely stand, created a sense of destiny among the tiny army. The march from Jerusalem to Ascalon was a nightmare that tested Baldwin's elaborate systems for managing his diseased body. His hands, now missing several fingers, were strapped to specially designed reins. His armour had to be modified with extra padding, where nerve damage meant he couldn't feel chafing that would create infected wounds. Most challenging was hiding his condition's progression from his men. The right side of his face showed visible lesions despite attempts at concealment. His voice, affected by throat involvement, required careful modulation to avoid the telltale nasal quality of advanced leprosy. Yet when he addressed his tiny army before marching, witnesses reported a voice that rang with such conviction that hardened Templars wept. God, Baldwin declared, has always favoured the few against the many when the few fight for righteousness. Coming from a boy whose righteousness was written in rotting flesh, the words carried weight that no healthy king could have matched. The forced march itself became a masterpiece of logistics and inspiration. Baldwin knew that arriving at the battlefield exhausted meant certain defeat, so he structured the march in careful stages that preserved his knight's strength while maintaining speed. Water sources were scouted in advance, rest periods calculated precisely, scouts deployed in overlapping screens to prevent ambush. But the true genius lay in psychological preparation. During rest stops, Baldwin moved among his men, allowing them to see his suffering up close. The diseased king sharing their hardships, asking about their families, remembering names and past services. It transformed duty into devotion. Veterans later recalled feeling they were part of something holy, a divine instrument wielded by a dying saint king against the enemies of God. By the time they approached Montgizard, Baldwin's 500 knights had been forged into a weapon of fanatical determination. The forced march to intercept Saladin required Baldwin to push his failing body beyond medical possibility. 16-year-olds shouldn't be able to lead cavalry charges. Lepers, in advanced stages, shouldn't be able to wear armour for days. Yet Baldwin did both through combinations of will, careful physical preparation, and increasing doses of poppy wine that his physicians warned would eventually kill him. He rode at the army's head, visible to all, turning necessity into propaganda. If the Leper King could endure such hardship, what excuse did healthy men have? His presence transformed a desperate gamble into a crusade. Knights who'd questioned following a diseased boy into certain death found themselves shamed by his example. When Baldwin's horse stumbled and observers rushed to help, they found their king had already corrected, his damaged hands somehow maintaining control. The miracle wasn't that he could ride, it was that he made it look effortless. The armies met near Montgizard on November 25th, 1177. Saladin's forces, spread out for plunder, were caught completely off guard by Baldwin's appearance. The Muslim commander had believed reports that the Leper King was bedridden. Instead, he faced a boy in shining armour, who raised the true cross overhead with hands that shouldn't have been able to grip it. Baldwin had orchestrated every detail of his appearance for maximum psychological impact. His armour was polished to blinding brightness. His surcoat bore the arms of Jerusalem in gold thread that caught the light. Most brilliantly, he'd had his helmet modified with a golden faceplate that hid his disfigurement while creating an inhuman, almost divine appearance. To Saladin's troops, it must have seemed that Jerusalem was defended by some golden avatar of Christian wrath, rather than a diseased teenager. The battle itself defied every military logic. Baldwin's 500 knights charged 26,000 enemies in a manoeuvre that should have been mass suicide. But the Leper King had identified the critical moment when Saladin's dispersed forces were most vulnerable, when psychological shock could multiply physical impact. He led the charge personally, couching his lance despite hands that could barely feel it. Behind him rode men inspired to madness by their king's example. The Templars, usually disciplined to fault, screamed war cries with berserk abandon. The secular knights who'd questioned Baldwin's rule now competed to stay closest to his banner. The initial impact shattered Saladin's centre, but this was only the beginning. Baldwin had trained his knights in specific tactics for fighting larger forces, rapid wheels and reforms that hit the enemy from multiple angles before they could organise resistance. Each charge was precisely timed, hitting just as Muslim units tried to form defensive lines. The technical excellence of Baldwin's battle plan deserves deeper analysis. He divided his small force into 3 wings, each with specific objectives that seemed suicidal, individually but brilliant collectively. The right wing, led by Reynaud of Châtillon, struck Saladin's baggage train, creating chaos in the rear and cutting off retreat routes. The left, under the Temple Master, hit the Egyptian contingent that formed Saladin's most reliable troops. Baldwin himself led the centre directly at Saladin's command position, a psychological masterstroke that turned military hierarchy into weakness. Muslim commanders, seeing their sultan threatened, abandoned their positions to rush to his defence, creating gaps that Baldwin's knights exploited mercilessly. The timing required split-second coordination that shouldn't have been possible in medieval warfare. Yet Baldwin achieved it through pre-battle drilling and visual signals that overcame battlefield noise. What transformed tactical success into strategic miracle was Baldwin's ability to maintain control despite his physical limitations. Medieval battles typically devolved into chaotic melees where command became impossible, but Baldwin had developed visual signals that didn't require verbal commands his damaged voice might not convey. Banner movements, horn sequences, even the direction his golden mask faced communicated orders to subordinates trained in the system. When his right arm became too damaged to signal effectively, he switched to his left without missing a beat. When exhaustion threatened to topple him from his saddle, he had himself partially strapped in while maintaining appearance of easy control. Most remarkably, he seemed to anticipate Saladin's every countermove, positioning reserves exactly where Muslim reinforcements would arrive. The boy who'd spent 3 years memorizing every battle report now demonstrated perfect pattern recognition in real-time chaos. The psychological dimension of the battle proved as crucial as the tactical. Saladin's army included veterans of dozens of victories, men who'd never seen Muslim forces routed by such inferior numbers. The sight of Baldwin's golden mask leading charge after charge created supernatural terror. Some Muslim chroniclers reported that the masks seemed to glow with divine light, that Christian knights appeared to multiply miraculously, that the very ground rejected Muslim feet. These accounts reflect not reality, but the psychological devastation of seeing certain victory transform into inexplicable defeat. Baldwin had weaponized his disability, turning his inhuman appearance into a tool of terror. The disease that should have made him pitiable instead made him terrifying. What kind of man continues fighting while his body rots? What power sustains him? The questions themselves became weapons that shattered Muslim morale. The slaughter was absolute. Saladin's army disintegrated, leaving thousands dead, including most of his personal guard. The great commander himself barely escaped, riding for Egypt with a handful of survivors. His magnificent tent, treasury, and personal effects fell to Baldwin's knights. Muslim chroniclers describe supernatural terror seizing their forces. Hardened warriors fleeing from a boy they outnumbered 50 to 1. Some reported seeing angels fighting alongside the Christians. Others claimed Baldwin himself glowed with divine light. The truth was more prosaic but no less remarkable. A dying teenager had analysed his enemy's weaknesses, chosen the perfect moment to strike, and executed a battle plan that military historians still study as an example of defeating overwhelming odds through superior tactics and psychology. The immediate aftermath of Montgizard revealed the price of miracle. As adrenaline faded, Baldwin's body began shutting down. Witnesses described him having to be lifted from his horse, his armour removed by others because his hands had seized into claws from gripping weapons. The golden mask that had terrified enemies hid a face twisted in agony as overwrought nerves fired random pain signals. His physicians later reported that the battle aged him 5 years in 5 hours, accelerating his disease's progression catastrophically. Yet even in collapse, Baldwin maintained strategic focus. He ordered immediate pursuit of fleeing enemies, preventing them from regrouping. He sent messengers to every Christian stronghold announcing victory, understanding that morale impact mattered as much as military results. Most importantly, he began planning how to exploit Saladin's weakness before the Muslim leader could recover. Even while being carried to his tent in agony, the Leper King was thinking 3 moves ahead. The aftermath of Montgizard revealed both Baldwin's genius and his tragedy. The victory bought Jerusalem years of survival, shattering Saladin's aura of invincibility and forcing him to rebuild his entire power base. But the physical cost to Baldwin was catastrophic. Within weeks, he lost most sensation in his legs. The golden mask that had terrified enemies now became necessary to hide facial damage that shocked even his physicians. Yet Baldwin used even this deterioration strategically. He made rare public appearances, each carefully staged to maximise impact. When he did appear, the visible evidence of his sacrifice for the kingdom transformed him from political liability to living martyrdom. Knights who'd plotted his replacement now competed to serve the Leper King, who'd saved Jerusalem at the cost of his own flesh. The long-term impact of Montgizard extended far beyond military victory. It shattered several myths that had shaped Levantine politics. First, it proved that Saladin could be defeated decisively, encouraging Christian resistance that might otherwise have crumbled. Second, it demonstrated that numerical superiority meant nothing against superior tactics and motivation. Third, and most importantly for Baldwin's reign, it established him as a military genius whose physical disabilities were irrelevant to his strategic capabilities. Young knights who'd whispered about the cursed king now boasted of serving under history's greatest tactical mind. Muslim commanders who dismissed him as a dying boy now studied his methods obsessively. The battle became legend within months, growing with each telling until Baldwin seemed less human king than avenging angel. The reality, a 16-year-old leper who'd simply outthought and outfought a superior enemy, was somehow even more impressive than the myth. The 2 years following Montgizard saw Baldwin IV transform from military commander to strategic architect of Jerusalem's survival. Unable to lead charges, he became a master of defensive warfare that would frustrate Saladin for years. His body might be failing, but his mind compensated with innovations that revolutionized Crusader tactics. He established a network of signal towers that could relay information across the kingdom in hours rather than days. He created mobile response forces positioned to reach any threatened point within 2 days' march. Most brilliantly, he developed what modern military theorists would recognize as defense in depth, multiple lines of fortifications that channeled invaders into killing grounds while preserving Christian forces. Every castle was provisioned for extended sieges. Every water source was mapped and protected. Baldwin couldn't feel the maps he studied, but he memorized every contour of his kingdom's terrain. The signal tower network deserves special attention as an innovation centuries ahead of its time. Baldwin recognized that Jerusalem's numerical weakness made information superiority crucial. He established a chain of towers, each within visual range of the next, staffed by trained observers who could relay complex messages through combinations of flags, smoke, and reflected sunlight. A Muslim army crossing the border could be reported to Jerusalem within 3 hours, faster than their own cavalry scouts could ride. But Baldwin's genius lay in making the system redundant and deceptive. False towers were built to confuse enemies. Multiple relay routes ensured messages arrived even if some towers fell. Coded signals prevented intercepted messages from revealing Christian plans. The system required significant resources to maintain, but Baldwin understood that knowing where Saladin would strike was worth more than additional soldiers. His ability to appear wherever threatened with whatever forces he could muster created an illusion of omnipresence that multiplied his effective strength. The political challenges of ruling while visibly dying required even more creativity than military innovation. By 1179, Baldwin needed assistance to mount his throne, and often conducted audiences from a specialised chair that supported his increasingly twisted frame. His hands could no longer grip a sceptre normally, so he had lightweight versions created that attached to his wrists. When his voice weakened, he developed a system where trusted advisors could relay his whispered words without appearing to speak for him. The fiction of royal vitality became increasingly elaborate. Audiences scheduled for his good days, doubles appearing at distance for ceremonies he couldn't attend, proclamations bearing his seal when he could no longer hold a pen. Yet everyone participated in this theatre because the alternative was civil war that would doom the kingdom. The economic reforms Baldwin implemented during this period reflected his understanding that military strength required financial stability. Unable to lead raids for plunder, as previous kings had, he needed sustainable revenue sources. He negotiated revolutionary trade agreements with Italian city-states, granting them commercial privileges in exchange for guaranteed annual payments rather than unpredictable tribute. He reformed the tax system to reduce corruption, appointing inspectors who reported directly to him rather than through noble intermediaries. Most innovatively, he created what amounted to a medieval bond market, allowing merchants to invest in future customs revenues in exchange for immediate payment to the crown. These financial innovations, designed by a king whose diseased hands couldn't count coins, provided the stable funding that kept Jerusalem's defences operational, despite constant warfare. Baldwin's relationship with his nobles evolved from mutual suspicion to something approaching reverence. Men who'd schemed to replace him now witnessed daily evidence of superhuman will. When the Count of Tripoli visited in 1180, he found Baldwin directing a council meeting, while physicians changed suppurating bandages, never pausing in his analysis of Saladin's latest movements. The Templar Grand Master reported watching Baldwin review defensive plans, while his remaining fingers were splintered after breaking from routine use. These weren't displays of stubbornness, but calculated demonstrations that the Leper King's mind remained sharp regardless of his body's decay. Nobles who might have challenged a weak king found themselves psychologically unable to oppose someone who suffered such torments for the kingdom's sake. Baldwin had transformed his greatest weakness into unassailable moral authority. The succession question that had haunted Baldwin's reign required delicate handling as his condition worsened. His sister Sibylla's marriage to Guy de Lusignan in 1180 created a potential heir, but also deep divisions. Guy was widely considered an ambitious fool. Baldwin navigated this by gradually introducing governance structures that could function without strong royal leadership. He created councils with defined powers, established clear chains of command, and most importantly, built institutional knowledge that wouldn't die with him. Young nobles were trained in his defensive strategies. Templars and Hospitallers were integrated into kingdom defence rather than pursuing independent policies. Baldwin knew he was building a kingdom that would outlive him by years, not decades, but every extra month of preparation might make the difference between orderly transition and catastrophic collapse. The personal cost of maintaining royal authority while dying became increasingly visible to Baldwin's inner circle. His chamberlain later wrote about finding the king unconscious from pain, having pushed through an entire day of audiences without showing weakness. His physicians documented a body that defied medical understanding. Advanced leprosy should have killed him years ago, yet he continued functioning through will alone. They developed increasingly powerful pain medications, knowing the doses needed would eventually destroy his remaining organs, but understanding that without them, Baldwin couldn't perform duties that kept the kingdom stable. The king himself showed dark humour about his condition, once joking that he was already embalmed and simply hadn't noticed death yet. This gallows wit helped those around him cope with the daily horror of watching a brilliant mind trapped in a decomposing shell. The physical reality of Baldwin's daily existence by 1181 would have broken most spirits. He was now 20, but his body resembled ancient descriptions of demonic possession more than young manhood. Leprosy had claimed his nose, requiring a silver prosthetic for public appearances. His legs were so damaged that walking was impossible. He was carried everywhere in a specialised litter that could be quickly converted to a battlefield command post. His remaining vision was failing, forcing him to rely on verbal reports rather than personal observation. Yet visitors consistently reported a mind that remained crystal clear, analysing multiple variables with computer-like precision. When Reynold of Châtillon proposed provocative raids on Muslim caravans, Baldwin correctly predicted not just Saladin's immediate response, but the second and third order effects such actions would cause. His prophecies of disaster if Reynold wasn't controlled would prove tragically accurate. The military campaigns of 1182 to 1183 demonstrated Baldwin's evolution from warrior to strategic puppet master. Unable to take the field personally, he directed operations through chosen commanders, providing detailed instructions that anticipated contingencies they hadn't considered. His battle plans read like chess grandmaster analysis. If Saladin moves here, we respond thus. If he divides forces, we exploit thus. When commanders deviated from his instructions, disaster usually followed. When they adhered to them, even mediocre generals achieved surprising successes. The siege of Kerak in 1183 showcased this perfectly. Baldwin, now blind and carried on a litter, arrived at a siege his commanders were botching. Unable to see the battlefield, he had terrain described to him and proceeded to dictate manoeuvres that broke Saladin's siege within days. The Muslim commander reportedly remarks that fighting Baldwin was like battling a disembodied intelligence that saw all possibilities. By 1184, Baldwin faced the ultimate test of his strategic vision. His body had deteriorated to the point where even his iron will couldn't maintain the fiction of active rule. He was completely blind, had lost most of his extremities to disease, and required constant medical attention just to survive. Yet his mind remained focused on Jerusalem's survival beyond his death. He orchestrated his own abdication, choosing his young nephew Baldwin V as heir rather than the controversial Guy de Lusignan. He created a regency structure designed to balance competing factions. Most remarkably, he negotiated a truce with Saladin from what was essentially his deathbed, using his personal relationship with the Muslim commander to buy Jerusalem precious time. Both rulers knew Baldwin was dying, but Saladin's respect for his opponent led to terms more generous than military reality justified. It was Baldwin's final victory, using his own death as a diplomatic weapon. Chapter 5. The Dying Light. Final Battles of Will. The last year of Baldwin IV's life, 1884 to 1885, represented something unprecedented in medieval kingship. A monarch ruling effectively, while his body literally decomposed. The 23-year-old king could no longer see, walk or use his hands, yet his strategic mind continued orchestrating Jerusalem's defence with precision that astounded contemporaries. Court sessions became surreal exhibitions where Baldwin, propped in a specialised throne, whispered commands to scribes while pus seeped through his bandages. The smell of death was so strong that courtiers burned incense constantly, creating a haze that made the throne room seem like some purgatorial vision. Yet from this living corpse came decisions that would determine whether Jerusalem survived another generation. When disputes arose over water rights that could spark civil war, Baldwin's solution balanced competing interests so perfectly that both parties left satisfied. When Saladin probed the borders, testing for weakness, Baldwin's defensive deployments anticipated every thrust despite his inability to read maps or dispatches. The technical adaptations that allowed Baldwin to continue ruling deserved detailed examination. His throne had been modified with a complex system of supports that held his body upright without appearing to do so, maintaining the illusion of royal posture. Speaking tubes allowed him to whisper to scribes positioned behind the throne, who would then announce his words, preserving the fiction that the king's voice remained strong. When documents required his seal, a mechanical device allowed the impression to be made by attendants while appearing to come from Baldwin's own hand. Maps were recreated in raised relief so he could feel terrain with his few remaining sensitive fingers. Military reports were delivered in a precise, verbal format he'd developed, allowing him to visualize battlefield situations without sight. These weren't mere accommodations, but sophisticated technologies that transformed disability into different ability. The court that had once pitied the Leper King now marvelled at his cyborg-like fusion of failing flesh and mechanical ingenuity. The relationship between Baldwin and Saladin in these final months transcended the typical medieval dynamic of Christian-Muslim hostility. Both rulers recognised a kindred spirit in the other, men of exceptional ability trapped by circumstances beyond their control. Saladin was building an empire while managing fractious allies who resented his Kurdish origins. Baldwin was preserving a kingdom while his body crumbled. Their correspondence, conducted through trusted intermediaries, revealed mutual respect that bordered on affection. Saladin once sent his personal physician to Baldwin with medicines that might ease his suffering, a gesture that shocked both courts. Baldwin reciprocated by warning Saladin about Christian pirates planning to raid Muslim pilgrim ships. These weren't betrayals of their respective causes, but recognition that honourable enemies were rarer than treacherous allies. When Baldwin proposed a 4-year truce in late 1184, Saladin agreed despite military advantage, because he knew the Leper King's word was more reliable than any treaty. The succession crisis that Baldwin had tried desperately to prevent erupted even before his death. His nephew, Baldwin V, was a sickly child whose survival seemed unlikely. Guy de Lusignan, married to Baldwin's sister Sibylla, manoeuvred constantly for power, despite the dying king's explicit attempts to sideline him. Raymond of Tripoli, the kingdom's most competent noble, represented the old guard who wanted experienced leadership. Between them stood Baldwin IV, blind and crippled, using moral authority and strategic brilliance to prevent open conflict. He created elaborate power-sharing agreements, extracted oaths of loyalty, and deployed his remaining energy to build consensus around young Baldwin V. The court became a chess match where the dying king moved pieces he couldn't see against opponents who waited eagerly for his death. That Jerusalem didn't collapse into civil war during these months was entirely due to Baldwin's force of will, projected from a body that medicine said should already be dead. The physical horrors of Baldwin's final months challenged even medieval tolerance for suffering. His face had collapsed to the point where speech was barely intelligible. Leprosy had attacked his throat, making swallowing agony and breathing laborious. His limbs were so damaged that even minor position changes required teams of physicians, yet he insisted on maintaining royal duties. When the Patriarch of Jerusalem suggested Baldwin retire to a monastery for his remaining days, the king's response was characteristic. A king may not abandon his throne while enemies threaten his people, whether those enemies be Saracens without or decay within. He continued holding court, directing defence and managing succession until March 1185, when his body finally refused all commands. Even then, he spent his last coherent days dictating detailed instructions for the kingdom's governance after his death, anticipating problems that wouldn't manifest for months. The documentation of Baldwin's final days provides intimate glimpses into medieval attitudes toward death and duty. His confessor, who attended him constantly, recorded conversations that revealed a mind wrestling with theodicy until the end. Baldwin questioned why God would create him for kingship, only to destroy him piece by piece, yet concluded that perhaps his suffering served to inspire others to greater sacrifice. He showed particular concern for other lepers, establishing endowments for their care and insisting they not be expelled from Jerusalem, as some nobles suggested. His last coherent political act was to summon Guy de Lusignan and extract an oath, sworn on holy relics, to follow the regency provisions Baldwin had established. That Guy would break this oath within months of Baldwin's death only emphasises the dying king's tragic understanding of his successor's character, combined with his inability to prevent disaster from beyond the grave. Baldwin IV died on March 16, 1185, aged 24. His death was simultaneously release from unimaginable suffering and catastrophe for Jerusalem. The careful balance he'd maintained through personal authority immediately began unravelling. Within a year, young Baldwin V was dead under suspicious circumstances. Guy de Lusignan seized the throne through his wife's claim, ignoring Baldwin IV's explicit provisions. The new king's incompetence and aggression provoked exactly the disasters Baldwin had predicted. Reynold of Chatillon's raids on Muslim caravans, which Baldwin had controlled through force of personality, now proceeded unchecked. Saladin, no longer constrained by respect for his deceased opponent, prepared for total war. At the Battle of Hattin in July 1187, Guy led Jerusalem's army to annihilation through every mistake Baldwin had warned against. By October, Saladin had taken Jerusalem itself. The kingdom Baldwin preserved through superhuman effort survived him by less than 3 years. The contrast between Baldwin IV's strategic genius and his successor's incompetence became painfully apparent in the kingdom's final crisis. Where Baldwin had carefully husbanded resources, Guy squandered them on pointless displays. Where Baldwin had maintained Muslim respect through honourable dealing, Guy provoked hatred through treaty violations. Where Baldwin had used defensive strategies that maximised Christian advantages, Guy saw open battle that played to Muslim strengths. Most tragically, where Baldwin had united fractious nobles through moral authority, Guy divided them through favouritism and incompetence. Saladin himself reportedly commented after taking Jerusalem that fighting Guy was like competing against a child after matching wits with a master. The Muslim chroniclers who recorded Jerusalem's fall consistently noted that had the Leper King lived even 5 years longer, their task would have been impossible. Instead, they faced opponents who seemed determined to fulfill every prediction of disaster Baldwin had made. The immediate aftermath of Jerusalem's fall sparked bitter recriminations that revealed how completely Baldwin's leadership had held the kingdom together. Nobles who'd served harmoniously under the Leper King now blamed each other for the catastrophe. The military orders, which Baldwin had coordinated effectively, pursued contradictory strategies that worsened the situation. The Italian merchants whom Baldwin had managed through careful diplomacy abandoned the kingdom for more profitable ventures. Every structure Baldwin had built required his personal touch to function. Without him, they collapsed like a body without a skeleton. The tragedy wasn't just that Jerusalem fell, but that it fell exactly as Baldwin had predicted, through exactly the failures he'd identified, prevented only by his living presence. His death removed the keystone from an arch he'd built through pure will, and the inevitable collapse followed with mathematical precision. The legacy of Baldwin IV extends far beyond the military victories and political manoeuvring that dominated his short life. He redefined what leadership meant, proving that physical strength was less important than moral authority and intellectual brilliance. Medieval kingship traditionally depended on the king's body, his ability to lead charges, intimidate opponents, and project vitality. Baldwin shattered this model, ruling effectively while his body literally fell apart. He transformed concepts of disability in medieval thought. Where theology taught that deformity reflected divine disfavour, Baldwin's obvious intelligence and success forced reconsideration. Some theologians began arguing that God tested his most beloved servants with the greatest sufferings, using Baldwin as their primary example. His ability to govern while dying also influenced medieval medical thought, challenging assumptions about the relationship between physical and mental capacity. Chapter 6. The Echo of Courage, Legacy of the Leper King. The immediate aftermath of Jerusalem's fall in 1187 sparked bitter recriminations about who bore responsibility for losing what Baldwin IV had preserved against impossible odds. Guy de Lusignan, captured at Hattin, blamed everyone but himself for the disaster. Raymond of Tripoli, who'd escaped the slaughter, was accused of treachery for his earlier negotiations with Saladin. Reynald of Châtillon, whose provocations had triggered the final war, was personally executed by Saladin for his crimes. But throughout these arguments, one name was invoked with universal respect: the Leper King, who'd held back the tide through will alone. Christian chroniclers emphasised how Baldwin's warnings had proven prophetic. Muslim historians praised him as the worthiest opponent Islam had faced. Both sides agreed that Jerusalem fell not because of Baldwin's failures, but because his successors ignored everything he'd taught them about survival in the Levant. The Third Crusade, 1189 to 1192, brought European monarchs like Richard the Lionheart and Philip Augustus to reclaim Jerusalem, but their efforts were hampered by ignorance of local conditions that Baldwin had understood intuitively. Richard, despite military brilliance, failed to grasp the political subtleties that Baldwin had navigated while blind and crippled. The English king's frontal assaults and chivalric challenges might win battles, but couldn't secure lasting victory. Philip Augustus, distracted by European concerns, abandoned the crusade early. Frederick Barbarossa, the most experienced, drowned before reaching the Holy Land. These healthy, powerful monarchs with vast resources achieved less than a dying boy with 500 knights had managed at Montgizard. The contrast emphasised Baldwin's unique genius. He hadn't just been a good king despite his disability, but possibly because of it. His weakness had forced him to develop strategies and insights that conventional rulers never needed. The strategic innovations Baldwin developed out of necessity became military doctrine studied for centuries. His signal tower network inspired similar systems throughout Europe. His use of terrain and fortification influenced castle design across the Mediterranean. Most importantly, his demonstration that intelligence and planning could overcome numerical disadvantage became a cornerstone of military theory. The University of Paris included his campaigns in its curriculum by 1250. The Mongols, of all people, studied his defensive strategies when planning their Western campaigns. Even Muslim military manuals incorporated lessons learned from fighting him. The bitter irony was that these innovations, born from a dying teenager's desperate creativity, outlived the kingdom they were meant to protect. Jerusalem fell using Baldwin's own defensive plans, poorly executed by inferior successors. The tools remained sharp, only the wielder's skill had degraded. The kingdom of Jerusalem limped on until 1291, but it never recovered the stability of Baldwin's reign. Subsequent rulers faced the same challenges: numerical inferiority, fractious nobles, and resurgent Muslim power. But none matched Baldwin's ability to balance these forces. The military orders like Templars and Hospitallers, which Baldwin had integrated into royal strategy, pursued independent policies that often conflicted. The Italian merchant cities that Baldwin had managed through careful diplomacy now dictated terms to weak kings. Most critically, the moral authority that Baldwin had wielded through his suffering couldn't be inherited or imitated. Kings who tried to replicate his strategies without his character failed miserably. The defensive systems he'd created worked only when commanded by someone with his intellectual gifts. The diplomatic relationships he'd built were personal, not institutional. Jerusalem needed another Baldwin IV, but got only pale imitations. Modern historians have extensively analysed Baldwin IV's reign, finding lessons that transcend medieval context. Military strategists study Montgizard as a perfect example of defeating superior numbers through psychological warfare and tactical innovation. Leadership experts examine how Baldwin maintained authority despite physical incapacity that would disqualify modern executives. Disability scholars point to him as perhaps history's most successful disabled ruler, one who transformed limitation into strength. Medical historians use contemporary descriptions to trace leprosy's progression, finding that Baldwin survived years longer than typical cases through sheer determination. Political scientists analyse his consensus-building techniques and institutional innovations. Each field finds something remarkable in the boy king who ruled while dying. The romantic tragedy of Baldwin's life has inspired numerous artistic interpretations, most notably in the film Kingdom of Heaven, where his portrayal by Edward Norton, behind an iron mask, captured something of his tragic dignity. But these dramatisations often miss the most remarkable aspect of Baldwin's story, its plausibility. This wasn't mythological exaggeration or hagiographical invention. Contemporary sources, both Christian and Muslim, confirm the essential facts. A child diagnosed with history's most feared disease became one of the Crusade's most effective rulers. A teenager who couldn't feel pain inflicted devastating defeat on one of history's great commanders. A young man who lost his sight saw strategic possibilities that escaped healthy generals. A king who couldn't walk led from the front. These paradoxes weren't coincidental, but interconnected. Baldwin's disease shaped the ruler he became. The medical reality of what Baldwin endured adds another dimension to his achievements. Leprosy doesn't just damage skin and nerves, it's a systemic disease causing constant pain, fever, and fatigue. The medications available in medieval times were mostly palliatives that created their own problems. Poppy wine might dull pain, but also clouds judgment. Mercury treatments could slow visible symptoms while poisoning the patient. Baldwin navigated complex political and military challenges, while managing a pharmaceutical regimen that would impair most people's basic functioning. He conducted diplomacy while fighting fever. He planned battles while his body consumed itself. He maintained a kingdom while dying by degrees. That he did this for over a decade defies medical explanation. Physicians who've studied the record suggest his survival required pain tolerance beyond normal human capacity. The psychological profile that emerges from contemporary accounts reveals a complexity that transcends the simple narrative of heroic suffering. Baldwin showed remarkable emotional intelligence, understanding how to use his condition to manipulate both allies and enemies. He could project weakness when it served his purposes, drawing enemies into overconfidence, then display strength when it mattered most. His dark humour about his condition, joking about being pre-embalmed, referring to himself as Jerusalem's resident corpse, helped others cope with the visual horror of his deterioration. Yet he also experienced profound depression, particularly in his final years when blindness cut him off from the direct observation he'd relied upon. His confessor recorded periods of religious doubt, where Baldwin questioned whether his suffering served any purpose beyond cosmic cruelty. These moments of vulnerability make his achievements more rather than less impressive. He wasn't a superhuman saint, but a young man facing impossible circumstances with entirely human doubts and fears. The institutional legacy Baldwin left, while ultimately insufficient to save Jerusalem, demonstrated remarkable foresight. His creation of formal councils with defined powers presaged later parliamentary developments. His integration of military orders into state defence became the model for later Crusader states. His financial innovations, particularly the proto-bond market, influenced Italian banking practices. His intelligence network structure inspired similar systems in European kingdoms. Most innovatively, his demonstration that physical disability didn't preclude effective leadership began changing medieval attitudes toward the disabled. Several European rulers with disabilities explicitly cited Baldwin's example when asserting their right to rule. Leper hospitals across Europe displayed his image, transforming him from cautionary tale to inspiration. The boy who should have been discarded became proof that human worth transcended physical wholeness. The final assessment of Baldwin IV must acknowledge both his successes and their ultimate futility. He preserved Jerusalem for his lifetime, but couldn't prevent its fall. He trained successors who ignored his teachings. He built institutions that crumbled without his guidance. A cynical reading might suggest his heroic efforts merely delayed the inevitable. But this misses the profound human achievement his life represented. In an age that valued physical prowess above all, a crippled boy proved that mind could triumph over matter. In a society that saw disease as divine punishment, a leper demonstrated greater virtue than healthy kings. In a world that discarded the disabled, a dying child became indispensable. Baldwin IV didn't just rule despite his leprosy. He transformed suffering into a source of strength that inspired men to impossible victories and earned respect from enemies who should have despised him. The deeper significance of Baldwin's story lies in what it reveals about human potential under extreme constraints. Every human faces limitations, physical, mental, circumstantial. Most accept these as defining boundaries. Baldwin treated them as problems requiring creative solutions. Can't feel your hands? Develop visual fighting techniques. Can't lead charges? Master defensive warfare. Can't trust your body? Build institutions that function without you. Can't live long? Compress a lifetime of achievement into whatever time remains. This relentless adaptation, this refusal to accept limitation as destiny, marks Baldwin as more than just a successful medieval king. He represents the human capacity to transcend circumstance through will and intelligence. His example suggests that our true limitations aren't imposed by condition, but by imagination. That what seems impossible might merely require a different approach. The story of Baldwin IV forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about human potential and the nature of strength. Here was a boy who should have died forgotten in some leper colony, who instead changed history through pure force of will. Every excuse we make for our failures seems pathetic compared to what he achieved while literally falling apart. Modern leaders complain about stress while Baldwin governed a kingdom as his body decomposed. We claim disability prevents success while he won battles blind and fingerless. We assume physical weakness means mental incapacity, while he outthought generals who could have crushed him physically. Baldwin didn't overcome his limitations. He weaponized them, turning every disadvantage into strategic advantage until his very weakness became Jerusalem's shield. What makes Baldwin's story eternally relevant isn't medieval politics or military tactics. It's the fundamental question of how we respond to catastrophic unfairness. Life cursed him with the worst disease medieval medicine knew, then demanded he save a kingdom. He could have surrendered to bitterness, accepted the comfortable invalidism his status allowed, or raged against divine injustice. Instead, he chose to squeeze every drop of capability from his dying body to build something larger than himself, to protect people who initially saw him as cursed. That choice to be useful rather than comfortable, to serve rather than be served, to fight rather than yield, transforms his story from medieval curiosity to universal inspiration. We all face moments when life seems impossibly unfair, when our bodies or circumstances betray us, when surrender seems rational. Baldwin's legacy whispers across centuries, fight anyway. If this story moved you, subscribe for more hidden histories of people who refused to accept the limitations others placed on them. Because somewhere in the past, someone faced worse odds than you ever will and chose to fight rather than yield. Their courage echoes through time, waiting to inspire anyone willing to listen. The boy who saved Jerusalem couldn't feel pain in his body, but he felt the pain of his kingdom and chose to bear it. What pain are you choosing to bear? What kingdom are you fighting to save? Baldwin IV proved that even death itself can be defied long enough to matter. The only question is whether we have the courage to follow his example.